in this video I will comment the paragraphs 7, 8, and 9 of the introduction of this book, the Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences. I do not comment word by word, but just the main ideas. So paragraph 7. Basically, it says that reflection, which is mediation, transforming immediacy into a thought. The example is this book. Through a thinking activity, a physicist would transform this physical object into a set of determinate quantitative forces, molecules, etc., etc. So, reflection, which is the moment of der Verstand, the understanding, is a moment in the development of philosophy, and it has burst forth, renewed itself from a historical perspective. History is dubious, but from a historical perspective, in the modern times, after the Lutheran Reformation, after the times of Luther, namely the 16th century. And what is meant here is basically that the Renaissance, which is a broad era between 15th and 16th century, even there were glimpses before, but broadly it's 15th and 16th century, the outburst of religious, philosophical, political ideas, geopolitical discoveries, etc., etc. And the Reformation indirectly was there were so many conflicted occurrences: discovery of America, the printing press, the fall of the Byzantine Empire, the rediscovery of the ancients. I will not make the story of the Renaissance, but basically that was the Reformation by Luther, Protestantism, religious conflicts, and eventually at the very beginning of the 17th century, we saw the rise and development of what would become modern science, the modern scientific method. Observation, hypothesis, experiment, an attention, a focus towards the empirical realm and not abstract theorizing. And the names which are most famous are Bacon, Francis Bacon, Descartes, and Galileo. And eventually later in the 17th century, Newton, which is kind of the pinnacle of this scientific revolution. And these thinkers, Bacon, Descartes, Galileo, are thinkers of der Verstand, of the understanding, of reflection, of one-sided thinking, one might say. And then Hegel mentions the philosophical beginnings of the Greeks, and the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, between 6th century BCE until 4th century, this is the golden age of Greek philosophy, but later there were Greek philosophers in the 4th, 2nd, and 1st century BCE, and even later in the early centuries of the modern, of the AD, the how do you call it in English, the AD, the Christian era. The Neoplatonists were partly Greek, but here the golden age of Greek philosophy was 6th to 4th century, with names like Parmenides, Heraclitus, Thales, Zeno, Pythagoras, Democritus, some skeptics, and of course Plato, Aristotle, and later we have Epicurus, etc., but Empedocles, etc., etc. So this was pure speculation. And Heidegger, 20th century German philosopher, said basically that philosophy speaks two languages, ancient Greek and German, which is partly true. But what is partly true is partly false. So, but mostly philosophy speaks Greek and German, and mostly German. So the Lutheran Reformation with the scientific revolution in the beginning of the 17th century got interested into the apparently immense and vast world of phenomena. And it is also mentioned in the preface of the Phenomenology of Spirit, namely that in the Middle Ages, the official story says, the thinkers were preoccupied with knowing the celestial spheres, which were considered to be perfect, whereas the earthly world was considered to be indeterminate, chaotic, disorderly, and the medieval thinkers thought about God only without caring about the world, and they were then in the late Middle Ages influenced by Aristotle. This is what we call scholastics, etc., etc. And the fundamental epistemological determination of modernity is the interest given to the earthly world, the world of phenomena, what is below the heavenly spheres. And this rebirth of investigation and scientific inquiry with the new scientific method, which was partly foreseen by the Greeks, but it became fully developed and modern with Bacon and Descartes and Galileo and eventually Newton, etc. So the knowledge of what is fixed, set, stable, what is universal within the world of phenomena, in the ocean of empirical singularities, and to discover the laws that govern the fleeting changes of phenomena, celestial phenomena, but earthly phenomena, meteorology, the fall of body mechanics, propagation of light, optics, etc. What would later become physics, and eventually the 17th century scientific revolution was mostly physical. It was mostly physics. It was in the realm of physics that discoveries were made. But then in the 18th century with Lavoisier we have chemistry. In the 19th century with Darwin we have biology. There were biologists before, but they are the symbolic moments in the development of their particular topic of investigation as a science with a rigorous method, which gave birth to the modern view that we have of physics, chemistry, and biology. And later, eventually in the 19th century, and early even in the 18th century with Adam Smith, economics tried to replicate the success of Newtonian science, then sociology with Emile Durkheim, and then politics started to become theorized, although there had already been a political philosophy. But yeah, that's what we call science today, the hard and human side, the hard sciences and the social human sciences. And this movement of reflection, which is an intellectual process, brought forth the laws, the genera, from genus, genera, the genera, the genders, not in the sense of sex, but in the sense of genera and species. I cannot pronounce this in English. Genres. Let us say the Latin word genera, genus, genera. So the laws, the forces of physics, the genera, the species, the fixed determination, the rationality inherent in the world. And in today's world, everyone knows that the world is rational. Whatever topic you investigate, even political theorists, when they make polls about an election, they believe that there is a rationality, that the voting patterns of the voters are influenced by sociological tendencies, average income, ethnicity, etc., etc. Okay, so the world of phenomena became present to the consciousness of man. And this has led to a mathematical view of the world, because it is Galileo who said that nature is written in mathematical language, and the success of the modern sciences has mostly been mathematical. Chemistry has been mathematized, biology although in Darwin there is no quantitative numbers, not many, but more and more in the 20th century and 21st century, advanced mathematics are being applied to biology, and in the social sciences there are statistics, quantitative determinations, graphics everywhere. So this rise of modern science has coincided over the centuries with the development and the application of mathematics to sciences, what we call sciences. Okay, and this, Hegel says, has been called philosophy. Newton, the mathematical principle of the philosophy of nature, something like that, the Principia Mathematica, the official title is the mathematical principles of the philosophy of nature. So Newton was considered as a philosopher, and Hegel says this kind of philosophy is anti-philosophy. But then Hegel will say what is anti-philosophy is part of the process of philosophy. But in a dualistic thinking, science, as we understand this in the modern world, in the modern West, is not at all what Hegel means by science. Although what Hegel means by science includes within itself the empirical sciences. It took me quite a long time to understand this. So hopefully you have watched these 11 minutes and now you understand what it took me many months, many years maybe to understand this idea. Okay. Okay. Then he talks about the principle of experience. And he says that experience contains the infinitely important. That's Hegelian humor. It's very complex to understand, but sometimes Hegel makes very subtle jokes, because infinitely important means infinite, you have to be in relation to yourself. So if I had to be honest to God and to Hegel, maybe they are the same. But if they were the same, they would be different because of inner self-contradiction, I guess. No, if I had to be honest with God, I must admit that sometimes Hegel has a brilliant sense of humor. I cannot deny this, because many times Hegel has made me laugh of a profound spiritual laughter. So, yeah. So, the principle of experience says that man, in order to acknowledge a content and to admit and acknowledge that a content is true, man has to be present. And more accurately, he has to find such a content in adequation, in accordance with the certainty of himself, the certainty of his self. Which means this view, which is a Hegelian view, speculative German metaphysics, but it is also the view of the Anglo-Saxons. And whenever I say the Anglo-Saxons, I simplify, because I mean modern rationalistic science, but actually modern rationalistic science is universal. I speak of the Anglo-Saxons because of Bacon and Newton and Locke, and because it is mostly in the Anglo-Saxon countries that this method is used. But although it's the scientific method, so it's universal. But I say the Anglo-Saxons because historically, so yeah, I simplify. So every scientist acknowledges that whatever he says or writes in his books, whatever theories he develops, he presupposes that the reader, if he wanted to be certain of what is ascertained, what is said in the book or whatever, he could potentially make the experiment for himself and see if it is true. That's why I know that in American high schools or junior high schools, they make kids do experiments with chemistry and stuff like that, but in most developed countries, but it's especially in America. So that, or the fall of objects from a certain height, that they fall at the same, they hit the ground at the same time, and the acceleration, the velocity with the height, the experiment that Galileo made. Potentially anyone with anyone could replicate these experiments. But people do not do this because they say, okay, Galileo was probably right, I will not. Yeah. And the problem is that the very complex experiments which are made in the Large Hadron Collider in Geneva, these particles colliding with one another to try to replicate the conditions of the Big Bang, well, the average person usually cannot afford to buy a Large Hadron Collider and have this in his garden. Usually not. So you have to take what the physicists say for granted. To say, maybe if I was a billionaire, I could buy myself a gigantic scientific instrument to verify and to check if what they say about particles is correct, but I will keep my money and I will trust them. That's the idea. But potentially, a scientist acknowledges that his presupposition, his theories could be verified. This is the principle of modern epistemology. And Hegel says the same thing. So experiment and speculative philosophy both contain the unity of certainty, that the self has to ascertain, to validate, to check if the theory is correct. Yeah. So I'm trying to help others understand Hegel. Whenever Hegel talks about the empirical sciences, he talks about what we call the sciences. Whenever he talks about die Wissenschaft, science, he means mystical knowledge, religious knowledge, if you will. So yeah, he said that the empirical sciences bring forth to daylight laws, universal propositions, a theory, the thought of what is given there. That's why, the Anglo-Saxon, again, the Anglo-Saxon philosophers who don't believe in metaphysics, but metaphysics means above the physical. A physicist is, by very definition, a metaphysician, because he's a subject and he thinks. That's enough for metaphysics to exist. But then what does it mean to exist? That's a metaphysical question. So, yeah. So, the anti-metaphysicians, they are self-contradictory. But metaphysics is self-contradictory also, so all in all. He says that Newton, for instance, has been considered as a philosopher. But for Hegel, Newton is not a philosopher at all. So he's very harshly critical of Newton. That's one of the many contradictions of Hegel, because he says that one should not let the empirical self, the singularity, decide and influence universal thought. But he, although I doubt his existence as an empirical individual, but whatever, he keeps criticizing Newton and praising Kepler with some sort of fanatical German nationalism. So, yeah. That's paragraph 7. And yeah, just one last comment. The English, the Anglo-Saxons, but mostly the English, but also the white Americans, usually they consider, or they have considered Newton as a philosopher, but here I think about the English, someone like Stephen Hawking and the guys like Dawkins, Stephen Hawking and Richard Dawkins, who are the modern embodiment of this rejection of metaphysics. For them, Immanuel Kant was one of the last great philosophers because he was a scientist, as they understand this. And for them, Kant is some sort of an island of sanity lost within an ocean of madness that they call German metaphysics, if they are aware of German metaphysics. So for the average Anglo-Saxon scientist, metaphysics is nonsense, and because German philosophers, most of them are metaphysicians, speculative metaphysicians, most of what they say is nonsense, except Kant, whose purpose was to, I wouldn't say to destroy metaphysics, precisely because he tried to preserve metaphysics, but to go to the root of what he thought were errors, to prevent errors from being made in the realm of metaphysics. So he's a metaphysical anti-metaphysician in a way, and that's why the English love Kant, because he tried to limit the pretense of metaphysics. And that's why someone like Bertrand Russell, although he kind of praised Hegel, but they were incompatible. Russell, for him, Hegel was some sort of an impossibility. But what is possible, what is impossible, that's a metaphysical question. So yeah, the relationship between Hegel, the writings of Hegel, and the Anglo-Saxon minds is very complicated. He attacks them with how should I explain this? With vigor. Yeah. Now, paragraph 8. No matter how satisfying this knowledge of the empirical field, the realm of phenomena, might be, there is an other circle of objects which are not included within what we call the sciences, namely liberty or freedom, spirit, and God. Because, Hegel says, they are not experimented, or experienced rather, they are not experienced in a sensuous way. These objects present themselves, according to their content, as infinite, which means only God can be free, because freedom for Hegel is relation to self in the other. When I equalize myself with an other, I am free because I recognize the other as being a reflection of myself. So only God can be free. And here the Anglo-Saxon must be praised because they are Protestants, the white, the WASP, they are Protestant, and they know that basically there is no free will. So what did you expect, I might say. So they are contradictory because whatever. But the Protestants know that there is no free will. Only God is free, because God is at home in his other, which is himself mediated in another. Yeah. Spirit, that's the same thing. And God, only God can know God. Yeah. And liberty or freedom, spirit, and God, real God, are experienced through thought, through thinking. Yeah. And whoever is not a self has no freedom. The animals are not free. They are wholly determined by the laws of nature. Freedom, if it exists, but as I've said, only God is free, but if freedom has any sort of ontological reality, only human beings could potentially be free. Animals, if they do not think, if they have no self, cannot be free. They are completely determined by the laws of nature. That's why, that's an aparté, I don't know how to say this. Those who praise nature, Hegel would say, nature is the realm of necessity. There is no freedom in nature. Nature is just mathematical laws expressing themselves. Everything is in relation to something else. So there is no freedom in nature. It is only thinking mind which can find freedom in nature by recognizing himself in nature. Yeah. And here, to illustrate, freedom, spirit, and God are not objects of what is understood as sciences, but the Anglo-Saxon would say that they believe that they can make experiments about these objects, for instance, by testing the stimulus and the chemical and electromagnetic reaction, the neural connections within the brains when subjects are confronted with the question of choice. And studies have shown that the decision within our brain is taken before we become conscious of taking the decision. So that's how some scientists have tried to prove that there is no free will, but others, like Dennett, have tried to prove that freedom evolves. That's the title of one of his books. When investigating the question of spirit, the Anglo-Saxons, the Germans would make speculative introspection and speculative thinking. The Anglo-Saxon would, as good empiricists as they are, they would go and study people who claim to have had spiritual experiences and put all sort of tests, measuring their heartbeat, asking them questions, studying their brain to try to understand what is a spiritual experience from an empirical and physical standpoint, which is contradictory, but yeah. Or when the question of God, the Anglo-Saxon mind, atheistic, rationalistic God, when he wants to know what God is, his view is, let us make a sociological study of the people who believe in God. We will have polls, statistics. This is the kind of work that someone like Edward Dutton has made. Religion and intelligence. It's a quantitative quantitative data, basically to explain that religiosity and IQ are inversely correlated. The most intelligent people are the least religious. The least intelligent in terms of IQ are the most religious. So that's the Anglo-Saxon way of envisioning the question of God or spirit or freedom. Yeah. And then I wrote the United States of America. They combine the most modern atheistic rationalistic science with the most old-fashioned forms of religious fundamentalism. And if it's not fundamentalism, it's just religious belief. So I wrote, what a strange country. That's very strange. But I guess that God is strange also. But yeah. Okay, then there's the Latin quote, nihil est in intellectu quod non fuerit in sensu. Nothing is in thought or in the intellect which had not been first in experience, which is the view of Aristotle. I simplify to the utmost. John Locke, we try to derive the characteristic of the mind from psychological determination. He said that basically the categories of the mind are derived from habits and from experiment, and the mind is born as a blank slate, and we fulfill or we fill in the mind with repeated experience of the world. That's John Locke in 10 seconds. If you want more, buy the books. And someone like Stephen Molyneux. Today, Stephen Molyneux is in the tradition of Aristotle and John Locke and Anglo-Saxon empiricism and epistemological skepticism. And then there's the other way, nihil est in sensu quod non fuerit in intellectu. Nothing is in the senses which had not been first in the intellect, in the mind. And here is the idealist view, the noetic view. Noetic means, it comes from nous, the Greek word which is the intellect, basically. The idea that spirit is the cause of the world, namely that the world of senses is the manifestation of an idea. And here we find Plato, Leibniz, all idealists, the Neoplatonists also, but mostly Plato and Leibniz, which are the opposition. You have Plato versus Aristotle in the 4th century BCE, and in the 17th century you have Locke versus Leibniz. And also Anglo-Saxon philosophy is very strange because it produced someone like Berkeley, who was a subjective idealist, but also one of the fathers of empiricism. So he's a very strange figure in the history of philosophy. But yeah, the connection is Plato versus Aristotle, and later Locke versus Leibniz. And Kant tried to reconcile Locke and Leibniz, and Hegel tried to reconcile everyone, basically. And he says that the feeling of what is right, and here the English language, I must acknowledge, is pretty well done, because if I had to translate literally, the sentence would be the feeling of what depends on right, in the sense of law, legislation, constitution, but it is also the feeling of what is right. So, yeah. the English language is pretty well designed, I must admit. So, the feeling of law, or what is right, and ethics, which is also what is right, and religion, has its root in thought, says Hegel. So, yeah. That's the paragraph 8. And now the paragraph 9. Subjective reason demands or requires to be satisfied according to the form, to be formally satisfied, by giving to the content, which is being or the world, the form of necessity. So, people who are scientists do not just want to know how things are, but they want to know why things are the way they are and why they have to be the way they are. Just an example, people can notice that in the United States of America, there's a higher proportion of black crimes than white crimes. This is a fact that can be noticed empirically. People can have the consciousness that there's a greater proportion of black criminals than Asian criminals. That's how things are. But then there's the scientist who wants to know why it is so. There's the social scientist who will say this is because of racism, systematic racism, oppression, capitalism, which denies them opportunities, the history of slavery, the legacy of slavery, white America, which is racist, the destruction of... Then there's the conservative who says this is the destruction of the traditional family, the breaking down of the traditional family brought about by the welfare state, the sexual liberation of the 1960s. So that there is the leftist view of sociology and economics. There is the conservative view, which is more political, but also economical and sociological. And then there's the far-right view, which says, okay, it's a question of IQ. They have, on average, a lower IQ. So because high IQ is correlated with inability to defer gratification, with violent impulses, there has to be, out of necessity, a higher proportion, etc., etc. So this is how a singular experiment or experience is transformed into necessity. But then people say your race realism is fraudulent, and those who say your political theory of capitalism depriving of opportunities is fraudulent. So then there's the endless debates between the left and the right in the sphere of science and philosophy, as they call this. So the low working class whites and the low working class blacks experience black crime directly. I'm not saying that but I say that the highest proportion of crimes committed by blacks in comparison to the same number of Asians or Hispanics. So the working class experienced this directly, and the intellectuals experienced this through the mediation of conceptual debates. Yeah. And then Hegel says, and also about this necessity. People in the right-wing spheres, free speech sphere, they want free speech. But if you are allowed to express you freely, necessarily truth will emerge, because truth is necessary. And this is the debate between rationality and emotions. The right accuses the left of being too emotional, and they say we are the side of reason and rationality. But if you leave aside all your emotions and become purely rational, we have a name for this. This is called a psychopath. A psychopath is someone who is very rational, but he has no emotions. Although strictly speaking, psychopath means the soul who suffers. The pathos means to suffer, and psyche means the soul. So the psychopath has been led to rationality, maybe because his soul suffers, and then he makes others suffers because of his lack of empathy and lack of emotion. So the sentence, let us be strictly rational, means let us be psychopaths, basically. So emotions hurt, but rationality also. And truth is necessary, but truth hurts. So suffering is necessary. But Jesus said, the truth shall set you free. So truth is ambiguous because it brings you freedom and suffering. And to be free in your suffering, this is Christianity, basically. So, yeah. And I wrote that that God, the real God, the highest God, has to love America, because America is the land of free speech, and eventually it is free speech which enables the emergence of truth. And I guess that God wants to be free, so God has to thank America for free speech, I guess. Yeah. Yeah, Hegel says that in these sciences, there's the universal, which is particularized. In biology, it's genus, species, but the universal is not showed and proven how the universal determines himself. How does the universal particularizes himself or itself? So there's a lack of method, as Hegel would say, and also the beginnings of the empirical sciences, namely immediacy, what is found there, the world basically, and so all sorts of presupposition. It is not showed or proven how this immediacy has come into being. The physicists presuppose that there is a physical world. The philosopher starts by doubting the existence of the physical world. That's what Descartes did. Maybe there is no physical world. Maybe I am deluding myself. Maybe I am hallucinating my reality. But at least I have the illusion that there is a physical world. Maybe there is no physical world, but there is the illusion of a physical world. So, but Hegel says the presence of the world has to be deduced. So Hegel is an inverted thinker in the sense that the modern scientists begin with the world and they elevate themselves to the universal, and Hegel, I must acknowledge that he's pretty smart, he begins with the universal and he deduces the empirical world. And this is idealism. All idealists have tried to deduce the existence of the world. And the Anglo-Saxons find this nonsensical, but yeah. How could the world come out of the mind of a German metaphysician? That's a question that the Anglo-Saxon struggled to resolve, I guess, to solve. Yeah. And yeah, Hegel says that this satisfaction, namely to deduce the existence of the world from pure speculation, is speculative thinking. And Hegel tries to prove why there has to be a world. This is the passage from the logical idea to the realm of nature, when the idea makes itself nature, gives itself a sensuous presence. So he says that speculative thinking contains within itself the moment of reflection, of mediation, and share the same forms, but adds its own forms, so to speak, which is the form of the concept, as Hegel understands, der Begriff, self-differentiating thought, self-movement, a negative, a differentiating relation to self, which sets a not self, and from this difference reestablishes self-identity. This is the infinite movement of thought. Yeah. So he says that the speculative sciences do not leave aside the empirical content of the sciences, but acknowledges and uses this content by acknowledging what these sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, and even the social sciences have in terms of universals, the laws, the forces, the generas, the categories, etc., the laws, etc., etc., but adds other categories as well. He says that the difference between the empirical sciences and the speculative sciences is a change of categories. And I wrote yeah, the illustration is like the difference between the hardware and the software. In the video game industry, it is common to recycle old games in a new HD version, modified. How do they call this? HD remastered. Basically, so you have the same game but with more categories. But actually, when not only you can, this would be the example of how the speculative sciences use the content of empiricism, basically by making an HD version of a remaster of Newtonian science, for instance, or Darwinian science. But in reality, the change of categories would be the change of hardware in the video game industry, from the NES to the SNES, PlayStation 2, PlayStation 5, or in the realm of computers or cell phones. There's a change of hardware which enables new possibilities. There's a difference between NES games of the 1980s and games on PlayStation 5. There's a difference between the computers in the 1970s and modern quantum computers. A change of hardware brings about a broadening of possibilities. This is what speculative thinking does. And if I had to illustrate, you say that the Anglo-Saxons, with their absence of metaphysics, which is itself a metaphysics, they're like trying to play, I don't know, what's The Last of Us or GTA 5 or Breath of the Wild, whatever, to try to program this on a NES of 1986. That's difficult. So you cannot categorize freedom, the infinite, spirit, God, with your limited hardware. You have to upgrade, basically. And also I wrote, I just go back what I said before, that a speculative philosophy has to deduce the presence of the world. But this is the kind of question that the modern cosmologists, astrophysicians, etc., they ask themselves: how come there is a universe? Could there be? This is the anthropic principle. Does the universe exist because we humans exist? And they have hypotheses about multiverses, bubbles of universal bubble, not universal, but bubble universes. So they are trying to solve the problems of empiricism by resorting to metaphysical questions, but they do this unconsciously. Hegel simplifies, says that I will show you why there has to be a physical universe. You don't need to go into the... I mean, you can, but the multiverse... Really? We have enough problems with one universe. What if there were many? What if there were an infinite amount of universes? Our problems... I can't imagine how complicated they would be. One universe is enough, I would say. As of now, let us try to solve the problems of this universe, and then we can think of other universes. Okay. And then Hegel says that basically speculative logic contains the previous logic, which is classical Aristotelian logic, and the previous metaphysics, which is the entire history of metaphysics from Parmenides to Hegel. And what I say basically is that maybe Hegelian logic has to be modified in order to include modern logic, which is symbolic logic, Frege, Pinot, Whitehead and Russell, the analytic school, the new logic, the symbolic logic, derived from the works of Frege, which has given indirectly birth to algorithmic logic used in computers. So eventually, if Hegel's logic is, if speculative logic is real logic, it has to include within itself Aristotelian classical logic and symbolic modern logic. So speculative logic conserves or contains the same thought determinations, laws, and objects, but by shaping them differently and adding other categories. Yeah, so that's the paragraph 9 in 40. I mean the paragraphs 7, 8, and 9 in 48 minutes. And I just finished by saying that he says that the concept in a speculative meaning has to be distinguished from what is ordinarily called concept, but I talked about this in my previous video. Der Begriff for Hegel is God, which is the human being, singular, particular, universal, and differentiated from himself. That's why I identify with the concept, and I try to think about other human beings as being my mirrors, which is difficult, but they can only show myself, I guess. And that's why human beings are made in the image of God, because every thinking human is a concept, because he has the moment of the singularity, particularities, and universality, which is valid only for thought. And yeah, and what we ordinarily call a concept is just a thought determination, what is abstracted from a concrete object, leaving aside difference. It's the moment of der Verstand, it's abstract identity. So it's one-sided, it's lacking, it's false, as Hegel said, but it's the power of the understanding, but it's kind of deluding. So yeah, I will stop there. I have commented these 3 paragraphs, and yeah.